Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing artificial intelligence and the markets surrounding it with returning guest Nick Patience, who heads up our research in AI, ML, and all things in that end. Nick, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be back again.
And great to have you on, especially with all of the craziness that is generative AI right now. There's a lot that we've been hard at work on in terms of really looking to assess this market and the dynamics, the players, market projections, and the rest of it. We've been through some crazy times of late.
We certainly have. If you think, I guess, at the time recording, we're sort of 6 and a bit months after the introduction of ChatGPT on November the 30th of 2022. And I've been reflecting a bit on that. So since that time, what's happened? So governments have been forced to rethink their technology strategies, in some cases industrial strategies, their strategic alliances. It's made AI pioneers reconsider their entire life's work and predict the end of humanity. It's accelerated the rush.
Other minor things like that.
Yeah, things like that. It's also accelerated the rush to regulate AI, which was going to happen anyway, but it's forced a lot of jurisdictions to speed that up. And it's created a run on GPUs, increasing in the process NVIDIA's market capitalization by, I calculated, by 137% from November 30th to May 30th, and then up 154% up until today. So that's a pretty good effect for what some people just call a chatbot. It's had some pretty seismic effects.
You would think it is seismic in so many different dimensions, but there's a lot that's in play around this. And given this very short run-up, we've seen some really dramatic evolution in just the way in which really people are thinking not only about AI broadly, about the specifics of generative AI, about its applications, really all of the different dynamics that are taking place within that market. There's a lot that is in play. And it's an environment that is evolving very rapidly. If we think about what those early days of ChatGPT, of just the text prompt had started off with, we've come a long way since then in what those implementations look like, what the applications look like, and really some of the conceptual thinking around what really generative AI is all about and really where it fits.
Yeah, exactly. On that last point, I guess, on the kind of conceptual level, I mean, we've gone from pattern classification in what we now call somewhat strangely traditional AI or traditional machine learning. So from pattern classification to content generation, we've gone from narrowly focused machine learning to potentially extremely broadly applicable generative AI. We've gone from deterministic to a certain extent and then predictive algorithms into purely probabilistic things. So there's lots of different ways this shift has happened. I now see vendors and to a lesser extent customers, but also investors thinking about traditional AI versus generative AI. And that's not to say traditional AI and all its kind of ability to make predictions has gone anywhere and gone away at all and is totally useful for so many different use cases. It's just that this looks and feels like something completely different. As you know, I've been looking at this space for over 23 years now, and I've never seen anything like this in terms of the level of interest from our customers and from segments that I've never had any interaction with. And it's swamped us and it's been really good and we've been really busy, but it's more than hype. There's something pretty fundamental going on here, but that's not to say that everything that went before doesn't have any value. It does. I think it's a question of putting all that into context, really.
In 6 months, suddenly we've got an old school version of AI.
Exactly. It's pretty wild.
Well, but even within generative AI, the ideas and what we've been thinking about as what it constitutes and how you work with it have changed, because we started out with text prompts and that's rapidly evolved into image manipulation and image creation and the integration of all of these different pieces and even the way in which we're working with the various implementations of generative AI are evolving very rapidly. We're now starting to see some of that melding of the different forms that it takes, the prompt structure or the prompt mechanisms, that's evolving rapidly as well.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It was very much, text first and let's see what happens. And then sort of image was, separate thing. And then other elements like code or video were separate, but they are starting to merge. But a lot of the merging is using text prompts to generate something else other than just text. But text is still obviously vitally important, but using text to generate images, to generate code, to generate video, to generate audio, that's happening and it's happening incredibly quickly. There's so many startups in this space, and there's so many open source models out there as well. There's potential for confusion as to where to place bets or to make investments, whether you're actually, investing money in the companies themselves or you're choosing to buy or build these things in-house. And there's a lot of questions a lot of organizations have to ask themselves. For instance, fundamentally among them, do I need a foundation model of my own? Not everybody does, and these things can be, as we know, extremely expensive to run. I have a whole kind of flow I can walk clients through as to whether you need these or not. And a lot of it's to do with obviously infrastructure in-house or the ability to pay for cloud-based infrastructure and skills in-house or, the ability to pay for systems integrators to come in and help you. There needs some clarity. And that's why, the thing we're going to talk about today a bit is why we decided to do this generative AI market monitor and try and put some stakes in the ground, really.
And speaking about that specific research, this is something where you've got an AI, what we refer to as a market monitor, which basically is a market assessment that's taking a look at this market and trying to at least scope and scale what the market looks like. Can you give our listeners a little background into what that is and how it goes about evaluating the market?
Sure. So we looked at 7 segments, essentially, of the generative AI software market. And just to clarify on the software stuff, we're really focused on that. We're not focused at the moment in the market forecast on the infrastructure underneath it. But the 7 segments are foundation models themselves. And then we looked at text generators, image generators, code, video, audio, and then structured data generators, which are often used to create synthetic data. So there's kind of 6 types of data and then the foundation models underneath them. And then we do here at S&P Global Market Intelligence inside the TMT group, we've been doing these market forecasts, which, as we say, we call market monitors. But we've been doing these market forecasts for a long, long time using a kind of rigorous bottoms-up analysis. And my colleagues and I, we went through when we identified a total of 262 vendors in the space overall and figured out the various growth rates of the subsegments and overall. So just to give you the kind of headline number, we calculated from 2023 to 2028 a compound annual growth rate of 58% from a fairly low base at the moment of something like $3.7 billion, rising up to $36.4 billion in 2028. And then within that, there are various parts of the market that grow faster than others. And obviously there's various parts of the market that have many more vendors than others. So just one little number on that last point. Of the 262 vendors we assessed in this forecast, 117 of them alone were text generators, and only 19 were foundation model companies or providers of various kinds. So there's a lot of disparity in terms of where people are playing in this market.
And in the various participants. Well, I think it's worth also identifying the difference between a bottom-up and a top-down market assessment. And you've touched on that, but I think providing a little bit of clarity, what we're doing is we're actually looking at the various companies in the market and valuing their various contributions, as opposed to the top-down, which is creating a model of what that full market could potentially look like and looking at all of the potential use cases, an approach that's, at least to our thinking, not as grounded as the bottom-up model and or less likely to give you a real feel for who's in the market and who those market participants actually happen to be and their individual contributions.
Yeah, that's right. And we're pretty it's a very rigorous process, and we're pretty confident that this results in an accurate, as we stand here in 2023. Anyway, obviously you're forecasting the future, and as we know, predictions are hard, especially about the future, as somebody once said.
Yes, it's the old Dutch saying. Yes, indeed.
Exactly. So we look at, so the advantage of doing it this way, we think gives you an accurate picture of that forecast. And we also look at the concentration level of the market. So there's always different ways of, how markets can be concentrated together. So for instance, here we find the top 20 vendors accounting for 55% of the total revenue in 2023, with the next 50 contributing 29%, and then a long tail, the 17%. And so that's a pretty competitive market at the moment. It's not too concentrated in terms of how the vendors are clustered together, but that's likely to change. I mean, when I was talking earlier about the 117 tech generators, essentially, I guess, to be blunt, there's a lot of companies there doing something quite similar to one another. And we know what happens when that occurs. There'll be some consolidation in the market. And as we go back to this forecast, which we will do in the future, we expect to see some of these various sectors change in terms of the structure and the size.
And that's the interesting thing about doing the bottom-up analysis is that you are actually identifying who those market players are, so that as that consolidation happens, as we start to see that shift in the market, especially in the market that is moving as enthusiastically, shall we say, as this one is, something that's certainly complex to get one's hands around. What are your major takeaways of the key aspects of what the analysis really shows?
Well, one of the questions we get asked a lot is, where do you think value will accrue in this market? And as we look out essentially to the end point of the market into 2028, at that point, if what we are looking at turns out to be the case, then the foundation model segment would be the largest, with the text generators coming next. And then there's various clusters around images and videos and code generation. But that only tells you one part of the overall story. Within these various sectors, that we think there's interesting things to look at. So we mentioned obviously the text generators. There's a lot of vendors in that space, and we expect some shakeout. If we look at the image generation stuff, which is a lot of the fun stuff to play with, I think is one way of putting that stuff. There's a lot of interesting images you can come up with.
Astronauts on horses, right? That's always good things.
Exactly. It usually does involve astronauts or something in space at some point. That shouldn't probably be in space. That tends to be the kind of driving theme for this. But we see, there's a lot of, there are some well-known startups in this space, but then there are obviously large companies like Adobe and some others here coming to the fore. And a lot of the use cases now, not surprisingly, are very much of the creative professionals. So not only artists, but marketing professionals, design, fashion, areas like that. And there's a lot of pickup there quite early, we think. There's obviously some concern around intellectual property rights, and there's concern around viral fake images. Those two things are big issues, but we think that some of these things, they'll be overcome. Whether they'll be overcome through self-regulation, through the technology companies themselves, or there'll be a legislation and regulation of some kind. I think it'll be a bit of both, and I think there will be regulation around that. One of the key challenges actually for this market as a whole is intellectual property rights and copyright law, and how those things may have to evolve over time, but maybe that's for another podcast. But one of the other ones I wanted to look at was the code generation market. So in theory, obviously, anybody who can write a language, whether that language is English or French or Chinese, can now generate code. Now, that's obviously true, but that's not particularly the point. The point is there already have been code generators around before generative AI, but how can generative AI code generators augment the developers we have and the developers we want to have? It's quite a small market at the moment. We think it's a very fast growing, and there's a lot of input coming from the large cloud providers, notably Microsoft and Google, but others as well. And we think this one has got real legs, partly because there's already well-established software testing methodologies out there. So if I wrote a piece of code for my company, it wouldn't just be chucked straight into production, and nor would yours, Eric, I'm sure. Even though it'd probably be better, but it won't be put into production. It'll go through all these testing methodologies.
You overestimate my coding skills, but
it'll go through testing methodologies. Now, exactly the same thing will happen with code that's generated via generative AI. And so, I think some of the fear mongering that goes around, all our proprietary code is going to get out there, it's going to get back into ChatGPT and all these kind of things. I don't really think that's so much the point. I'm sure there'll be some more scare stories down the line. But I think it's because there's already that structure in place. I think this is a really interesting area. And it's very much augmenting what people already do and enabling them to do it faster. And it's also resurrecting some not dead languages, but languages for which, frankly, there are not a lot of young developers who are interested in learning, like COBOL being the classic example. We talked about all this many years about legacy COBOL developers and how you're going to deal with those people who are retiring. Well, I hate to say it, but a lot of them have passed retiring by quite a long way. And so it's kind of, how do you actually deal with that code that exists in mainframes, especially in a lot of industries such as financial services. And this generative AI code generation area is a really good use case for that, I think.
Well, we're dealing with language models. And not surprisingly, software languages actually fit pretty well. Now, to your point, there are some cautionary tales. The Samsung testing script situation in which test scripts got dumped into a particular large language model and were able to be extracted is one of those. But I think what you're identifying is that key part of it, which is that we're still developing general guardrails for how you use these capabilities, how you apply them. And with code generation, we've got that opportunity to be able to use some force multiplication for a resource that's already pretty constrained, which are coders. And being able to leverage and facilitate what they're able to be able to do a lot of the the fundamental, substructure work, things to be able to build the program scaffolding that's necessary to build larger frameworks and allow coders to then work on those things that are more complex and harder to replicate. Because again, that model has to be built from something in order to generate it. It has to know enough about what ought to be there in order to build something real. And in a world in which so much of the code that's actually written is already being pulled from open source repositories, things that we can use to be able to train large language models, here's something where it actually can save developers that cost of going out, finding the code they need, and building at least the base framework to be able to get applications up and running more quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And we've been talking to a lot of vendors in the space of development tools in the broadest sense of the word, and they see a lot of opportunity there, understandably, and they're obviously best placed to kind of implement that. But the open source point is actually an interesting one, and whether we're talking about code or talking about the effect of open source on this market, it's pretty huge. I mean, there's the Hugging Face repository of open source models. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I know they've been adding thousands of various language models or foundation models of various kinds over the last few months. And again, these are things that have to go through testing, but there's a lot of potential out there for organizations that do more than dabble, actually do some experimentations into whether they can effectively build their own model, whether they can just use fine tuning, which is taking an existing foundation model and fine tuning it with some of their own data to make it appropriate for them. I think there's a lot of interest among corporations mainly the larger ones, let's be honest, than smaller ones, in doing exactly that. Because again, like the previous wave of AI and ML, explosion of interest, I'd say 2014, 15, 16 timeframe, there's a lot of that. I need to get me some of that AI stuff, go get some of that AI stuff. And then once they figure out, do the experiments and they think, well, this is a bit too broad, then they narrow down to very specific use cases. And that's what we have been rolled out over the last few years. So when we do our other surveys, our Voice of the Enterprise AI and ML surveys we do every year, a lot of that, we do one on use cases, as the listeners probably know, and one on infrastructure. And on the use cases, they're quite specific in investment banking. It might be, it's fraud detection, et cetera. But there's, and in healthcare, it's clinical workflow optimization. These are very, very specific things which are not necessarily useful in other industries. Why? Because they're based on the data that those organizations have. And so the same thing goes here. The difference slightly is the existence of those foundation models for language in general. And that opens up a new opportunity. And one of the major opportunities is the way that we interact with applications as humans. And the reason it opens up the opportunity is because it can generate text as opposed to just quote unquote understand it, which obviously doesn't really understand it. This is probabilistic stuff. But it looks like it does. But if you can also generate language out of that, you can have much more interactive chatbots that might actually work this time around. And so, there's a lot of other areas such as search and knowledge management, areas that have been tried for years and have not really worked. And the fundamental thing that's happening is you're unlocking the value of all that unstructured data that every large organization and many medium-sized and smaller ones have, but have never really been able to harness and generate value from. It's always been something to manage, to archive, to maybe delete, to store, but not to actually do anything with particularly constructive. And it's been the promise, I'll be honest, of machine learning for years to do that. And it's had some success, but it's quite limited. This, I think, has the potential to really unlock that value.
Well, there's that question that you're raising, which is, for a lot of these applications, maybe an existing foundational model will be enough to start with and to get them going, and the role that the Hugging Face class of organizations have in being able to provide those now gives a new aspect of the market that, hey, there is now the potential for trade in the foundational models, in the tuning of the foundational models with your own data, to be able to actually leverage all of the data that you have to do something more meaningful.
Yeah, exactly. And it comes back to that point of whether you as an organization need a foundation model, and do you have the alternatives will be essentially there's kind of three ways you can go about this. You can do prompt engineering, so figuring out what kind of prompts get the most effective predictions out of models. And then there's plenty of ways of doing that, and there's a lot of It doesn't require a huge amount of skills. And then you have the fine tuning of the model, which does require skills, but there are open source alternatives. But eventually there are skills that have to be required. And then if you really think a foundation model is going to give you a unique competitive advantage and you have the resources to do it, then go build a custom model. S&P Global has made it clear in public that S&P is building its own foundation model. We can do that, and we're doing our own proprietary financial data. But not every organization can do that. So there's alternative routes to taking advantage of generative AI. But I come back to all the kind of thing that the stuff that it's really good at, like content creation, code generation, summarization, semantic search. That's not to take away from traditional AI, which is very good at things like classification and computer vision and process automation. And so we need to get to that point where, and we will do eventually, where people figure out that generative AI can augment all sorts of use cases, traditional AI, but traditional AI also has its own uses. The one thing I would add, though, is when we can get to the kind of chaining effect of chaining models together and handing over more sophisticated APIs with prompts themselves, you can then start to see automation happening, processes being driven by a single generative AI prompt, which then generates something else, which generates something else, which generates something else, which executes code somewhere and has some sort of outcome. Now, we're only in the very, very early, I would say, weeks of that. This is a very fast-moving space. But that's where you start to feel some real value there in automating processes, because that's essentially what software does, isn't it? And I think we'll get there eventually, but it's very, very early days.
Yeah, that's that iterative process. Yeah, I've seen that interesting Kensho demo in which there's code generation based on the prompt that then pulls more data that then gets wrapped into an analysis of that data that then gets delivered. Yeah, it's getting into that next stage of leveraging the foundational pieces and then moving beyond that. But to your point, even classical, I guess I have to get used to identifying that as what we had been doing. AI kind of applications are all still very relevant in that if you're looking at a generative model with billions of parameters, the training costs alone are going to be very significant. And if you can target a specific use case that doesn't require billions of parameters, can look at the classical ways of doing that analysis, it's all a matter of what you're trying to achieve, what your budget is to make it happen, and how you actually can approach solving what are now a much more interesting set of problems.
Yeah, and I think that brings us on nicely to a brief discussion about infrastructure. As I say, our model is a software market forecast. Our generative AI market monitor is focused on the software aspects. Now, we know, as I'm sure the listeners do, that this does require, as you just said, if you want to build your own foundation model from scratch, it requires a lot of compute resources, storage resources, networking, and so on and so forth. And whether you rely on hyperscale cloud vendor, or you want to do this on premise, you want to do this in a hybrid environment, and even if you want to do it at the edge, which could be extremely unlikely at the moment, but these involve resources. So what we've noticed in amongst some of our colleagues who are focused on infrastructure, perhaps more than I am, everyone is affected here. Every one of the infrastructure vendors, and most of them are somewhat overwhelmed by the amount of interest they've had, and this spans NVIDIA and AMD and the other chip companies that can offer these kind of accelerators are one area. I've been talking to quite a few data center providers. I'm not a data center expert at all, but they've had companies coming at them from vertical market segments, as they see it, that they've never dealt with at all, saying, we need to do this, and we're really interested in doing this. How many GPUs can we get hold of? What are the systems and how quickly you can get them, and things like that. And whether you think those people are, running too fast or just going after some sort of holy grail, I guess is to be determined. But the interest is real. And we've even seen areas such as vector databases. So vector databases have been around for a long time, but vector databases and the way they store data is exactly how large language models want that data to be stored, and that's how they want to interact with it. And so my colleague Jim Curtis on my team, he's been talking to all the vector database companies, some of which are 25 years old, and they've again had interest from vertical markets they've never even bothered to try and sell into, or tried to years ago and they had no interest, and now everybody wants to know who they are. So it's having this spillover effect into all these other areas. Not just NVIDIA, all these other companies, having real huge up levels of interest in what they do, and that is basically down to generative AI.
Everything old is new again. Bell bottoms are back. Man, we're just the pendulum swings, right? But hey, this is this. We know these cycles happen in tech. It's always interesting to see how these have all shaken out.
Yeah, and so we're going to have a lot of research coming out. We've created a little tiger team inside the analyst team across channels, cross areas, and we're planning various bits of research. We've got our Voice of the Enterprise AI and ML infrastructure survey coming out soon. We're doing another one on through our DevOps channel on how generative AI is affecting code generation in more detail than we've obviously been talking about here. We've got another we're looking at vector databases with all these kind of things I mentioned, and then data centers and how things like the liquid cooling market has heated up is the wrong expression, but you know what I mean. It's, that area is
it hasn't cooled down, but
no, it hasn't cooled down. No, there's always a need for it. But that's again directly related to this, because if you had a data center and this is very simplistic, obviously. If it was full of CPUs and you replace it with one that's full of GPUs, that costs a hell of a lot more, and it eats up a lot more energy and creates a lot more heat. And so, there's all these other knock-on effects that this is having, and it's all, it's not all due to the fact that November the 30th of 2022, OpenAI decided to slap a free interface on top of its model, but it's a lot to do with that, and it was going to happen at some point, and just they did that at that point. And I was talking to, before that happened last year, I was talking to a lot of the vendors that have these large language models, and they've been building them for years. And they were saying, well, we've got a really good one, and ours is better than that one, or it's more appropriate for this use case. But you had to take their word for it. There was no way of knowing. And now, you can play with these things to a certain extent and figure out which ones are best for the use cases for which you're trying to solve. So I think it's it's had to happen at some point. It's happened, and although I don't think we can have 6 months periods quite as crazy as the last sort of 6.5 months have been. The cat's out of the bag, and I think we're going to see such knock-on effects throughout. From the top of the stack at business applications right down to the chips and everything in between.
And hopefully things will be at least not quite so crazy, but hey, we'll have to see where it goes.
Yeah.
Especially it seems like we've got a lot more to talk about. So, Nick, I want to make sure that we take a marker to get you and Jim and other members of the team back on to talk about everything from the infrastructure to support this and really where we go next, these next stages. But this has been great. We are at time, so we're going to call it at this point. But thank you. I appreciate all the information, and we'll see where all this stuff shakes out.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me. It's been really interesting. So I look forward to coming back soon to explore more areas.
Well, and it's so much more to look at. But that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright and Ethan Zimmon on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we'll be digging into a whole range of different technology perspectives. Hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.